So for those of you that don't know me, I am Debbie and I am a Wilder Future Officer at Warwickshire Wildlife Trust. I've been there about 5 years now. My details are just down the bottom here if you do need to contact me about anything. Please do feel free to use social media to talk about this event. We do have our social media accounts down here and we've got some hashtags up here if you'd like to use them. This webinar in particular is very fitting this week because it's National Mammal Week and bats are our only flying mammal here in England. And also it is of course Halloween week, and bats unfairly, in my opinion, get a very bad rep around this time of year. This webinar is being able to be held because it is part of a funded project by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, our Wilder Future for Warwickshire project, which I'll talk about a bit in a moment. So the project itself has just kick-started after a bit of a shutdown during the pandemic, as I mentioned. The idea is that we are training young adults in conservation, but also in marketing and communications, so that you can go out there and raise awareness about all of the things that you're passionate about in the environment, and try and make some change so that you feel empowered and able to do that. Ideally, later on in the project, there will be the chance for our younger adults to liaise with and engage with and discuss all the environmental issues with our long-standing members and volunteers, so that we can transfer skills and get some mixing there. The actual project is based around your interests and your availability. So, for instance, this is why this is happening on a Monday evening, because most of our young adults are free on weekday evenings. So we try and centre it around what you want to learn and also when you want to learn it. At the moment we're digital, but hopefully when things calm down a little bit, we'll be able to do some more things in person as well. So my colleague Faye, our Community Engagement Officer at Warwickshire Wildlife Trust, recently did a video of Bubbenhall Wood, one of our reserves, all about an introduction to bats. So I'm going to play you that video. It's about 8 or 9 minutes long, and it's a really interesting introduction, so I hope that you enjoy it.
Hi everyone, I'm Faye from Warwickshire Wildlife Trust, and I'm here at the Bubbenhall Wood and Meadow Nature Reserve because today I'd really love to talk to you about a fascinating creature, bats. So bats are mammals like us, so they're warm-blooded, they're covered in fur, and they feed their young with milk. Now, unlike us, they are a flying mammal. In fact, they are the only flying mammal, and they come from an order of species called Chiroptera, which basically translates to handwing. As you can see, there's the elbow here, the forearm, the little thumb that sticks up, and really long, elongated fingers in which the skin has formed in between. So we have 5,500 different types of mammals on Earth, and 1,100 of those are bats, which means that bats make up a fifth of all mammals on Earth, which is a pretty incredible number. In the UK alone, we have 18 different species of bats, and they actually became a protected species in 1981. Now, contrary to belief, bats will not cause damage to your home. In fact, this is the Joanina Library in Portugal. This is a unique library because it has its own bat colony as a form of defence against book-eating insects. Now, bats are all different sizes and colours. However, bats in the UK are all fairly small in size. I want to talk a little bit about the common pipistrelle, which is the bat that we are most likely to see at Bubbenhall or in your gardens. Now, the common pipistrelle is a really small bat. He's about half the length of my thumb. He weighs more than a 1p piece, but less than a 2p piece. So next on the list of common bats that we're likely to see whilst out and about is the soprano pipistrelle. Now, as the name suggests, they are very similar to the common pipistrelle which we've just seen. However, there are some slight differences between the two species. In fact, they were only separated in taxonomy in 1999 when scientists realised that soprano pipistrelles echolocate at a slightly different frequency, and they have slightly different food and habitat to the common pips. So next on the list is our noctule bat. So the noctule bat is actually the UK's largest bat. They tend to roost in holes in trees as opposed to buildings, and they're often seen flying high above the canopy in search of their insect prey. So the next bat I'd like to show you is the Daubenton's bat, or sometimes referred to as the water bat. Now these bats can be identified by their size. So they're a small to medium sized bat. They've got brownish fur and a greyish tummy with a pink face. Now they have the term water bat because they like to forage for their food close to the water. So they often roost in trees, in bridges, under tunnels, in canals, and they will take insects, midges, caddisfly, mayflies off the surface of the water. In fact, they can even use their feet and sometimes their tails to help forage whilst they're feeding. Now this is the brown long-eared bat. Now it certainly lives up to its name. Its long ears are almost the same length as its body. It's a medium-sized bat and can be seen feeding around hedgerows and has a soft, slow, fluttery flight which can help to identify it. So the last bat I would like to show you is the natterer's bat, which is a widespread but scarce species across the UK. It likes to feed down low amongst the trees and will take prey directly from the foliage itself. As you can see, it's fairly light in colour with a light brown fur, and they like to roost in old buildings including churches and castles, but rarely in houses. So I hope that helps to give you an idea of just some of the bat species that we have here in the UK. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the bat life cycle. So bats form colonies over the winter and they hibernate. Come the spring and summer, they have a maternity roost and they give birth to just one baby. Now the common pipistrelle babies can weigh up to 25% of the mass of the mother, which is the equivalent of giving birth to a 2-stone baby. Now the babies grow up very quickly. They leave the nest at about 4 weeks old, in which they can fly and feed for themselves. In the autumn they form harems, they swarm and they mate, and the cycle starts again. Now bats can live up to 30 years old but are endangered due to their slow breeding rate. So where do bats live? Well, bats like to live in roosts. They love cool, damp places. They sleep upside down or they crawl into all sorts of crooks and crannies. They've been found roosting in barns, sheds, caves, trees and under buildings. Bats will tend to return to the same colony, and most colonies in the UK are around average 50 bats. So what do bats eat? Well, all British bats eat insects. Bats need to eat about 1/3 of their body weight every day. In fact, a common pipistrelle needs to eat about 3,000 insects every night. So when and where can you see bats? So bats are nocturnal, which means that they come out at night time. So early evening, dusk is the best time of day to see bats. You may be lucky enough to have bats feeding in your garden, but if not, head to your local nature reserve or somewhere like Bubbenhall Wood to come and see bats in action. Now, once here, keep an eye out over water, look up in the tree canopy and also along hedgerows, because they're all the kinds of places that different species of bat like to feed. So how do bats actually find their food in the dark? Well, their eyesight is about as good as ours, but they use something called echolocation. Now, echolocation works when the bat shouts through a gap in their front teeth at around 120 decibels. The sound travels out, hits the prey, and then is reflected back to them. Now, those amazing ears that they've got pick up the sound and they know exactly where that prey is. We've actually copied bats' use of echolocation to help aeroplanes fly at night. Now, we can't hear bats talking to each other. We have to use something called a bat detector. And what a bat detector does is it turns the inaudible sound into something that we can hear. So this is a bat detector, and what it can help us to do is determine the species of bat depending on the frequency that we pick up. Different bats call at different frequencies. For example, a common pipistrelle will call at 45 kilohertz, whereas a soprano pipistrelle will call at 55 kilohertz. A noctule might call at 25 kilohertz. So bat detectors come with a little cheat sheet, so depending on the frequency that you pick up, you should be able to determine the species of bat that you're seeing. So this dial on the side of the bat detector turns it on and affects the volume, and the main dial sets the frequency. So if I set it to 45, I'll tend to walk with it on 45 because that's the bats that I'm most likely to pick up, our common pipistrelles. So the flight can also help to determine what bat species you're seeing. Brown long-eared bats can be found feeding around vegetation. Common pipistrelles have a twisty, turny, erratic flight. Dorbenton bats can be found over water, and nocturnal bats often have a high, straight flight along the tree canopy. If you want to help bats in your own garden, there's lots of things that you can do. You can have at least one tree or shrub, plant night scented flowers which will attract insects, as will garden lights. You can install a bat box, and lastly, just tell your friends how cool bats are.
So Faye mentioned quite a few of the common bats that we have in Warwickshire, for example, the common pipistrelle, the soprano pipistrelle, nocturals, Natterer's bats, Dorbentons, and brown long-eared bats, which are actually my personal favourite. But we do also have some other bats in Warwickshire that I'll talk to you a bit about now. So these tend to be a bit rarer. So we have the Barbastelle bats, and you probably can't really see it very well in this picture here, but they have really quite a distinctive nose and ear pattern. We've actually had a specific Barbastelle project in Warwickshire. They can be a bit rarer to find, and you can find out all about that on the Warwickshire Bat Group website. We also have Brants or whiskered bats, previously considered to be one species, actually now separate. Brants bats are maybe a little bit more likely to be found in woodland. Then we have a bigger bat, a more medium-sized bat, the Leisler's bat, which are generally more associated with the serotine and nocturnal bats. We have lesser horseshoe bats. So these you can hopefully see have a really funny looking horseshoe shaped nose. They're really quite rare and constricted in range, so we're quite lucky to have them in Warwickshire. They're your classic kind of tent bats, as some people call them. When they're seen hibernating in areas like caves and cellars, they just simply hang down from the ceiling. They're not crawled into crevices or anything, they hang down tent-like from their feet. We also have serotine bats, which are really quite a large bat. And we have Nethusiast pipistrelle bats, which are much smaller. They're like the opposite end of the spectrum. Another pipistrelle bat that we have, previously not differentiated as a different species to the common and soprano pipistrelles, but now that we know it is different and you can find it across Warwickshire. So just some ones for you to look out for. Here are a few maps of some of our rarer bats, just to give you a flavour of where they can be found. So the Barbastelle I mentioned with the specific project is generally found towards the south of the county. Then we have the lesser horseshoe bat that's found in specific places in the south of the county as well. And we have the serotine bat, which has a more even distribution, particularly towards the west and south of the county, or vice county. So just to give you a flavour, the serotine isn't a particularly rare bat, but it is rarer for Warwickshire in particular. Bats and the law. So bats are really quite heavily protected by the law. You're pretty much not allowed to do much with bats at all. You can't disturb them, injure them or kill them, but also their roosts are protected. And recently that changed to include unintentional disturbance as well as deliberate disturbance. So you could get into trouble if you damage or destroy or disrupt roosts. Of course, if you kill bats or you illegally possess them or try to trade them as well. They're protected under Schedule 5 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which I did talk a little bit about before in our hedgehog webinar just a week or so ago. Essentially, this means that if somebody is going to develop an area or build, they need to take bats into account and they need to mitigate for them if there's going to be any negative impacts. Several of our species are UK Biodiversity Action Plan species, and although this is now kind of a defunct concept, it's still used to promote those certain bat species, and really local authorities should be trying to provide habitat and enhance habitat for them where they can when it comes to planning. Also, some of our bats are biodiversity indicator species. So bats are incredible indicators of biodiversity because of their sighting on the food chain. So they will eat the insects, as Faye mentioned, they're all insectivorous in the UK, and that then indicates the health of the plants as well. So they kind of give you an idea of the health of the entire ecosystem, fauna and flora wise. So biodiversity indicator species like some of the bats that we have in the UK here are used by DEFRA. They are used by the government to see if the government is really hitting its targets in terms of biodiversity. So some of those species include the lesser horseshoes and serotines and nocturnes and so on, as listed here. What I'd like you to do really is to put yourself in the mind of a bat. So think of yourself as a bat, if you can, and think about the things that you might need. So there are three things really. You're going to need food, you're going to need to access food, and you're going to need somewhere to live and to rest up. So in terms of foraging areas that you might require, bats use water, so they might drink from water, but also insects congregate around water and can be found above water, so they'll go for those. Particularly the Dorbenton's bat that Faye mentioned. This is infamous for hunting over water bodies. Actually has a really cool scoop tail that you can hopefully see in the picture here, and these really big feet to help it to collect these insects. So that's a particular water favourite. Also woodland, so we do have a lot of woodland specialist bats. In particular in the UK we have Bechstein's bat, which I'll talk a bit about later, but also bats like natterers and BLEs, brown long-eared that is, they all use woodland too to find food. Bats will forage along grassland and farmland. So in particular, horseshoe bats have been found in England to like alpaca farms. And this is potentially because the dung that the alpacas produce is fed on by dung beetles, which are a source of food for the bats. Also, places like gardens, allotments and parks provide valuable feeding habitat for the insects that bats need to eat. Bats also need commuting habitats and commuting areas, so they need to be able to reach those different foraging areas. So they'll use particular linear features, so features that are in lines. So they particularly like hedgerows, they like watercourses like rivers and canals that are lined with vegetation, tree-lined paths even in more urban areas, and also woodland edge, again another linear feature. In terms of roosting, where they live and where they rest up, their requirements are going to differ depending on the time of year. So as Faye mentioned, bats have different times of year when they do different things. So they need a place to mate in the autumn, so they generally have swarming areas. They need a place to rear their young in the summer, so they need maternity roosting areas. They need somewhere to hunker down in and hibernate in the winter, because they are true hibernators, just like hedgehogs. When there's no food around, there's no point in them wasting energy, so they hibernate. They also need somewhere to temporarily rest and feed at different times, so they might need somewhere just to gobble on a moth, for instance, and you'll often find the wings of moths removed and at the base of these feeding roost posts. And they might need somewhere to just to temporarily rest up, for instance, if there's a massive thunderstorm and they just need to hunker down somewhere for a little bit. Roosts afford bats protection from predators. They don't have a huge number of predators, being flying mammals. However, other things fly too, so birds of prey in particular, and things like sparrowhawks in urban areas will take them. So they provide protection from those. And also, for instance, in woodland, they might be more susceptible to things going into their roost from the ground that can climb trees. So weasels, stoats, things like that might enter if they can. So small entrances to their roosts are beneficial to stop these other predators from getting in. They use roosts as areas to congregate and socialise and communicate with each other. Usually they're in colonies, in groups within these. And of course, the roosts provide them protection from the elements. They help them to reduce heat and water loss so that they conserve energy as well. Bats frequently change roosts, so this will depend on where they want to be at a certain time. So they might find that they're using particular resources for foraging at certain times, so they might roost nearby. It'll also help them shed their parasitic loads if they move from roosts. If some have been attacked by predators, they'll be able to move, and it allows them to find the optimum roost for them. and to also sometimes in what we call fission-fusion societies, mix with other individuals in different social realms. So these are some examples of roosts. We have some hibernacular. These are winter roosts where bats go to hibernate. So these tend to generally be places that are quite cool, but also quite humid to reduce heat and water loss. So examples of these might be railway tunnels, caves, and cellars, areas such as that. Even dry stone walls, they can hunker down in the crevices there. Also, they use bat boxes to roost in. So these are artificial man-made boxes that we put up in buildings and woodlands in particular to provide them with a bit of extra area for them to roost. They use natural roosts in particular in woodlands. So they use features that have already been made for them in woodlands. So these might be things like cracks in trees. So you can see the birch is cracked here, very long roost that goes up here. They will always roost at the top on the roof. Other things like broken branches and woodpecker holes provide good roosts in there, and bark roosts as well, so they'll shelter underneath any loose flaking bark. Bats in the UK don't tend to excavate their own roosts. They rely on natural features or other animals doing it for them. So woodpeckers are actually really important because they do excavate roosts that bat will use. Also, bats will roost in buildings, so we'll talk a bit more about this later, but all they need is an entrance that's about the width of your thumb, and that's all a pipistrelle in particular would need, so they can roost in the smallest of places, and they can get in under tiles, under the eaves, and they frequently are found in attics, those that roost in buildings. Again, we'll talk a bit about that later. So for now, what I'd like to do is bust some myths about bats. So I've got 9 facts, and I'd like you all to have a go at guessing whether or not these facts are true. So some of them are true and some of them are false. I'll give you that as a clue first. They're not all true or false. The polls that I'm going to run on Zoom are completely anonymous, so please don't worry about your answers. There are no repercussions. So fact number 1, bats fly into your hair and get stuck. So I'll start the poll for that now. Okay, most of you have voted. I'll just give you a few more seconds. Great, okay, I'm going to end it there. Okay, so those are the results for you all to see. So you can see that most of you voted that it was false. Okay. So if you want to know the answer, you were indeed mostly correct. It is false. So this is actually thought to be an old myth that was to deter young women from going out at night. Bats, as we know, have okay eyesight, as Faye told us, but they also have their excellent echolocation. So this actually prevents collisions. They can be quite agile flyers, so there's no need for them to fly into your hair. So it would be a bit unusual. They might fly close to you, but it would be unusual for them to fly into your hair and get stuck. Okay, so the next fact, bats can carry rabies. I will start the poll for this. Again, if you can cast your votes. Just a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll there. So as you can see now, most of you thought that that was true, that fact. Okay. So I can tell you that that is indeed true as a fact. So some bats in the UK carry what we would call a non-classical type of rabies virus. So not the common one that we associate with dogs and dog bites, but it's a type of rabies virus. However, the rates of them carrying that are very low. Only 40 out of 13,000 tested specimens have been found to test positive for this. Generally, the advice, though, of course, is to avoid touching bats or approaching them. If you do get involved in surveying for them, you will always wear gloves for this reason. The virus is transmitted by the bat biting you or by it transferring it through its saliva if you've got a wound or it's a scratch or something like that, if it's infected. So don't go handling bats anytime soon. There's a very, very small risk that you might get you might be exposed to a rabies type virus. Okay, so the next fact is bats are aggressive and bare their teeth at humans. So I'll just start that poll now. Okay, most of you seem to have voted, so I'll run that one in a few seconds. Okay, so the majority of you have voted false for that one, but that's not true. Once again, I can tell you that most of you are correct. This is actually largely false. Bats are generally not aggressive. Of course, like any animal, they can be if they're threatened or they feel the need to defend themselves or they panic. However, the baring of teeth isn't really an aggressive stance. It's simply that they're actually using their echolocation to figure out what's going on. Okay, fact number 4, bats help to make chocolate and tequila. Bit of a different one there. I'll launch that poll now. Most of you have voted. Any last minute votes going in there? Okay, I'll end that poll. So a little more split for this one, but most people have erred on the side of that being true. I can tell you that you were mostly correct once again. That is true. So not in the UK, sadly, but plants in the tropics often rely on bats for pollination, a little known fact. And these can include things like mangoes, bananas, vanilla plants, and cocoa, and even the plant that we use to make tequila. So if I can get this to share, I'm going to show you a little video clip, a little trailer about a man in Mexico, a Batman in Mexico, who has striven really hard to try and find out how bats are pollinating tequila in particular, and to try and preserve those bats so that they can also preserve tequila, amongst other things. He's done so much work in Mexico to help bats. So the next fact is that some bats suck blood. So I'm going to launch that poll now. Okay, most of you voted. I'll end the poll there, I think. Okay, so the vast majority of you have voted that that is true. I can tell you that it's actually false, but it is a bit of a trick question. So there are 3 species of vampire bat that are in South America. 20 to 30,000 years ago, they were elsewhere on the globe, but now they're just confined to there. They don't actually suck blood. They make a graze on the skin and then lap it up with their tongue. So they actually prefer the blood of livestock to humans, thankfully, but they might actually be of use because in one sense, they're not so evil that people associate with Halloween. Actually, the anticoagulant that they use is being looked into because it might be helpful for stroke victims. And as you can see from the picture here, they actually look quite adorable. So they're not all bad. The next fact is that bats can be caring towards each other. So I'll launch that poll now. Okay. I'm going to end that one because most of you have voted. So this was a very affirmative, 100% of you voted that that was true. I can tell you that that is indeed true. So in particular, in reference to the vampire bats, they will mutually groom each other as part of their colony, and they will even regurgitate blood for one another for those that are in need. So if one of them hasn't fed that evening and is hungry, another one may well regurgitate blood for it to drink and therefore provide it with some sustenance. Okay, a very controversial one and topical at the moment. The next fact, bats passed COVID-19 to humans. I'll launch that one now. Okay, most of you voted, so I'm going to end that poll there. So this one was almost a 50-50 split, just swinging onto the false side. So technically I've put this as false because the virus did likely come and originate from horseshoe bats in China, but it didn't directly pass to us. It passed to us likely through an intermediate host. Current consensus thinks that this is probably pangolins, the most trafficked animal in the whole world. Unfortunately, horseshoe bats were likely also the reservoir for SARS, but again, this was passed through an intermediate host, this time civets. Fruit bats were also thought to have been the reservoir for Ebola, but again, there was an intermediate host, monkeys. A few bats in the UK have actually been found to have coronaviruses, but there are many coronaviruses, and the ones that have been found in the bats so far over here have not been found to be ones that are harmful to humans, thankfully. Okay, bat fact number 8, bats socially distance. I'll start the poll again now. Okay, most of you have voted, so I'm going to end it there. The general consensus seems to be false, although it's not clear cut. Quite a few of you have voted true. Okay, the answer to this one is that it's true in some cases at least. So bats in America sometimes suffer from what's called white nose syndrome. So this can really be quite a lethal fungal disease. We're on the lookout for it having spread to England, which would be very serious if it did take hold here. But those bats in a certain species, little brown bats that they have over there, that are sick with this particular fungal disease are groomed less often by the other bats in the colony. Also, vampire bats who are sick tend to groom each other less often. So the vampire bats themselves will groom others less often, and in return, they'll be groomed less often by themselves. However, this doesn't seem to be too much the case with the close family members of the colony. So perhaps they have little social bubbles like we've been having with COVID. And the last fact, so number 9, bats host more disease-causing viruses than any other groups of animals of similar species diversity. So I'll launch that last one now. Okay, most of you have voted, so I'll end it there. It's almost a 50-50 split on this one, and just tipping the scale towards true. So the answer to this one is false, not in particular. However, we do often associate bats with viruses for reasons that we've probably noted earlier in some of the other facts. Bats themselves have evolved over 52 million years, which is a really, really long time. So over this course of time, several viruses have evolved with them. But they don't seem to be that affected by these viruses themselves, even though they often carry them. And one line of thinking suggests that this is because they actually have a really strong immune system to deal with the fact that flight is energetically costly, so they just can't be getting sick all the time. Unfortunately, the fact that they can fly does mean that they tend to spread the viruses further, and also the fact that they're quite sociable and they roost together in colonies also tends to spread the diseases. And this can be more of a problem, of course, when they're roosting close to people. They also have quite long lifespans, which again is a factor when you're looking at zoonotic diseases. So I hope you enjoyed learning about those bat facts. And now we'll move on to surveying for bats. So there's a really good guide on the Bat Conservation Trust website, which gives you all the guidance on all the different surveys that you can do for bats. But for today, I'm just going to give you a general overview. So first of all, you might want to survey buildings. So generally, we know that bats can roost in buildings, or at least certain species. And I mentioned some buildings that they might want to roost in. So these might be general buildings like houses or factories. They might be barns, bridges, churches, or even underground sites. There's actually a big Bats in Churches project going on at the moment. So there's a link just here if you do want to check that out. And there's also lots and lots to do with surveying for bats and bats and buildings on the BCT, the Bat Conservation Trust website. But if you're suspecting that bats might be roosting in some of these buildings, for instance, and you've got a development that's going to either demolish the building or make some changes around the building, then you might want to do some kind of survey. So what you would first do is check out both the external and internal features from what you can see. So you'd have a go at having a look at what access points there might be for bats, keeping in mind, of course, that all they need is a thumb's width, and possible roosting places. So you might see that there are loose tiles on the roof, for instance, so they might be roosting under those. So you do that both outside, and then you would have a look inside. And the BCT has this very useful infographic just to show you the types of areas that bats might use on buildings. So it's really quite extensive if you think about that tiny little space that they need. And of course, these tend to be more likely to happen in older buildings. So they particularly might use under the eaves, under tiles, as we've mentioned, maybe under windowsills or porches. They'll use attic spaces. They might go under gables, under guttering, under flashing. So there's lots of places that you would be looking to see if there are any potential access points for bats to be getting in. You'd also be looking for signs of bats. So obviously, if you saw any live or dead bats, that would be a sign that bats are generally maybe using that building. But there are other signs to look for as well. So there might be urination stains or discolouring. It might smell quite heavily of ammonia. So bat pee, especially if there's been lots of bats roosting there, can be quite the odour. So you might even smell this. You might see staining, so bats have quite greasy fur and they often leave a dark stain around the entrances that they use. You might see feeding remains, I mentioned for instance earlier, like moth wings. You might even hear them squeaking if they're actually there, and you might well see bat droppings. Now bat droppings look similar to rodent droppings, but if you were to pick them up, of course with gloves and then wash your hands anyway, you would find that they're not elastic like rodent droppings. They're very crumbly because insects eat invertebrates, so they all break up when you crumble the dropping. Different species, of course, leave different droppings, and if you're any good at your droppings, then you might be able to differentiate what bats have been there, even if they're not present at the time. So this is a great infographic from Acer Ecology showing you the differences between the droppings of different species. So some are easier to differentiate than others. So if you've got ones to compare, you'll find that nocturals and serotines, purely because of the size of the bats themselves, actually leave quite large droppings. And also you might be able to get an idea from the smell. So I mentioned the ammonia smell. So nocturnal bats in particular smell, their droppings smell quite a lot, as do Daubenton's bats. Daubenton's bats have some that look a bit like a hockey stick amongst them. You also get ones like Methusias pipistrelles, which are quite distinctive. They're very long, thin and smooth. Pipistrelle droppings in general tend to sort of break up quite easily into small fragments, and again are quite small, given the fact that pipistrelle bats themselves are really quite tiny. Brown long-eared bats tend to leave quite knobbly in appearance droppings, and then you get ones that also look quite knobbly, like barbastelles, but they tend to be in clumps of 3. So they're all different characteristics. If you're into the droppings, you might well be able to determine which bats have been present. So we're just going to do a tiny mini poll with this information in mind to see if you can guess the dropping, see if you can guess the bat species that left this dropping at the top there. I'll just start this poll. You can have a bit of a guess now. Seems to be more people unsure on this one. Not all of you have voted yet. Okay, I think we've got most of the votes come in. Any last minute votes? Give you a few seconds. Okay, so most of you seem to have gone for common pipistrelle as the bat that would have left these droppings at the top there. But there are entries really in all of the options. So I can tell you that the bat to have left these droppings was actually a Daubenton's. And the key here is this hockey-shaped 90-degree angle that you can hopefully see at the top on the left of the droppings there. That was really hard. I don't expect you to get that. We've only got that one, so don't worry, you won't have to guess loads and loads of droppings. But it's just interesting, another field sign for you to think about. Okay, so moving on to looking at buildings. So you might also want to check out winter hibernation sites. So again, you might actually see the horseshoe bats, you know, hanging tent-like from the top. But other bats will roost in the crevices in these, so you might want to be looking in the crevices in a dry stone wall, for instance. If you had a bat license, you could use an endoscope, which is essentially a flexible torch that we'll see being used later. And again, you might want to look for signs like droppings. If you thought bats were likely to be present, you might want to move on to confirm that presence or absence. And to do that, you would do what are called dusk emergence and dawn re-entry surveys. So bats being nocturnal, you would see which bats, if any, came out at dusk and re-entered at dawn. So you would count those bats, you would try and distinguish the species from the way that they're flying, and other cues that you could use. And you could use a bat detector, like Faye mentioned, to listen to the calls, again, to determine the species. So you could also use thermal imagery to do this. The image here is actually of a bat box, and you can see a little colony of bats at the top there. But you could use thermal imagery cameras to actually look at the bats in flight. You could record that and also view that later. That's one big advantage there. So I'm going to show you a video now on YouTube of thinking about doing a building dawn and dusk survey. Okay. And if you've determined that bats are indeed present in this building, then you'll probably want to check out the roost characteristics. So you'll want to find out how big the roost is, you'll want to find out what direction it's facing, whether it's sunny or not, how warm it is, how humid it is, if there's lighting outside, where that lighting is, how bright it is, what time it comes in. And this is probably because you might well need to make an alternative roost with similar characteristics if that roost is going to be destroyed, for instance. So you want to find all these bits out. Okay, and then you might well want to do some tree surveys as well, again for similar reasons, and these follow a similar pattern. So again, you would look to see if there are any features on that tree that bats might be using. So if you've got ivy, you know that bats might be roosting behind it. We know from having looked at tree roosts earlier that they might be using woodpecker holes, for instance, or cracks in the bark. They might also be using things like rot holes and crevices at the bottom of the base of the tree even. And they'll also potentially feed on, use the branches at the top to feed on as perches. So again, you might get those feeding remains underneath. And again, you're looking for similar signs like urine, staining, odours, etc. And again, if you think that it's likely and you need to, you might then, with the licence, need to inspect the roost with an endoscope and have a look at what's going on. You can also, again, do presence and absence surveys. So you'd be looking at dusk and dawn again to see when they're emerging and re-entering, and look at the roost characteristics as well. There's a great guide to this, Bat Roosts in Trees, which is a full book if you're interested in that. And there's also some information on the Bat Conservation Trust website where this infographic came from. So you might also want to do some activity surveys. So for instance, if you're tasked with finding out what bats are using a woodland and when, you might want to take some transect walks, slow walks, along a designated path along that woodland at night to see how many bats you're seeing, which species of bats you're seeing, where they're flying, so maybe where they're commuting to and from, how fast they're flying. You can use characteristics of their flight, like phaser, to determine potentially the species. And you can also, of course, take your bat detector to see which species that you've got going there. You can also set static detectors. So these are detectors that you leave in place for several weeks, even months, in a particular area, and you just leave them to record. And then you download that data and you have a look and you analyse it to see which bats have been present. So you can't really determine the number of bats, but you can determine the species by looking at the equivalent bat sonograms of their calls that you get out of it. So sometimes there is software to automatically do this for you. And of course, that whole thing is quite less labour intensive than doing lots of transects. And it does mean that you get lots and lots of data from it. So some examples here. This here is a hockey stick shaped call that you would see on a sonogram. And that's actually characteristic of a pipistrelle bat. And this pipistrelle bat, if you can see in this sonogram here, you've got lots of these calls being made here, is a bat that's feeding. So it's a pipistrelle bat again. You can see a slight hockey sickle shape here, hopefully. And you can see the bat calls themselves get closer and closer and closer as the bat gets closer to its food. So it's calling more and more frequently as it's honing in on its prey. And then there's a bit of a, what would be a raspberry type sound as it what we call a feeding buzz as it gets its prey. If you're interested in bat calls, our very own John Russ from Warwickshire Bat Group has written a magnificent book, which is kind of the leading standard, which is really interesting. And you can also use a bat call key on this site listed here. It's known as a sort of vagrant species that occasionally turns up. Sorry about that, we'll play it this way. So what we're going to do now is have a listen to some bat calls. So one thing that I would really recommend, if you can get hold of, borrow one, or maybe you can put it on your Christmas list for next spring when the bats come out, is to get yourself a magenta bat detector, or you can get other brands, but this is essentially a heterodyne type bat detector. It's your beginner's level, the one that Faye showed you, where you can change the frequency on the wheel here, and you can listen out to your bat calls. And you can get this in conjunction with the FSC guide, Guide to Bats, which has got that sort of cheat sheet that Faye mentioned, and it tells you all the different frequencies. And again, I mentioned Batlib, the app that is really useful, and you can hear bat calls on there. So that's really good. And you can get out, you can go out at dusk or dawn or whatever, and you can go out to all these different places and listen out for different bats. Play about on your bat detector, have a look if you can see if you can match the different types of flight with the bats that you think you're hearing. If you get really into it, you can even buy more expensive bat detectors, ones that can connect to your smart meter, for instance, the Echo Meter Touch, and that will connect to your smartphone, sorry, and you'll be able to look at the sonogram type diagrams that I mentioned. But for now, we're just going to have a listen to some bat calls so you can get an idea of how they sound for the different species that you'll find in Warwickshire. So you may well want to use earphones for this. I've tried as much as I can to increase the volume of the calls and make them as clear as possible, but some of them might be a bit lower just in their nature. So the first call that you'll hear is Brant's bat, followed by Whiskered bat, which are very similar calls. They reach a peak frequency, as Faye mentioned, roughly about 50 kilohertz, so slightly higher than your common pipistrelle. They're fairly loud and they sound a bit like a machine gun, particularly the Whiskered, I think. Similar to a Dorbenton's bat that we'll hear again later, but a bit quieter. So I'll just play you Brant's first. Okay, and then I'll play you Whiskered. You could hear a little bit of a feeding buzz in there as well, a little raspberry sound when it caught its prey. So the next one is a soprano pipistrelle. So as Faye mentioned, that's 10 kilohertz higher than a common pipistrelle. That's the main way that you can differentiate them. All pipistrelles sound a bit like they've got loud wet slaps and kicks and clicks, and you'll hopefully hear the wetness to the slaps when I play it you now. Again, a feeding buzz near the end there. The next one is the lesser horseshoe, which has a very different sounding call. It's very high, it's 109 kilohertz-ish as peak frequency, so you'll often miss this if you've got your heterodyne bat detector set to about 45 like you normally would to catch the majority of the bats. It's a distinctive call, very warbly. Here you go. Sounds a bit like an alien, doesn't it? Okay, the next one is Natterer's bats. So they're roughly a similar kilohertz frequency to common pipistrelles. They're quite irregular, fairly loud, and they're quite rapid. I personally find these one of the hardest to distinguish. Okay, the next one is Dorbenton. So I mentioned before this is very machine gunny. Again, a similar frequency to common pipistrelles. Again, you could have heard a feeding buzz near the end there. Next one is the Seratine. So this is a bit of a lower frequency, around about 32 kilohertz, quite irregular, and it's got quite slow clicks and chops. And the next one is a similar sounding Leisler's, but even lower this time on your bat detector. Again, you'd probably miss this if you had it set for 45. It's about 26 kilohertz at its peak. It's got slow chip chops, but it's got more chips than chops, which will be necessary later. Okay, so the next one is a common pipistrelle. So Faye mentioned this one again, wet slaps and clicks. And that's differentiated again from the other pipistrelles by the frequency, really, where it reaches its peak. So the next one is a noctual. So this is really quite loud. This bat flies often quite in the open and up high and quite early. And it's got a distinctive chip chop sound at 20 kilohertz. Okay, then the barber stele, again, I find this one quite hard to differentiate. Again, it's lower, about 26 kilohertz though, so that's often an indication. Okay, and then we've got the enthusiast pipistrelle. So again, very wet, slappy, like all the pipistrelles, but this one's generally at 40 kilohertz, so a bit lower than. And the last one is the brown long-eared bat. So you will rarely pick this up at with the bat detector. Because a brown long-eared has such big ears, it only needs to shout very quietly for it to pick up the bounce back from its prey. So it doesn't shout loud at all, and you'll find it quite hard to pick these up. However, I've tried to amplify this as much as I can for you to hear it. Okay, so with these 5 bat calls on this second page in mind, I'd like you to try and guess the calls of the next 5 bats. So you've got one of each of the bats. So this is quite hard, but I'll do some polls as usual. So here's the first one. I'll play it to you first. Okay, so I'm going to play it another time just for you to hear it again. Okay, and I'm going to launch the poll for that to see if you can guess which species of bat made that call. Okay, most of you have voted, so I'll probably end that there. So the majority of you voted for nocturnal, and I can tell you that was correct. Very, very good. Chip chop, very loud, quite clear. Okay, and now for your second one. Okay, so I'll launch the one for that. I think that one's really hard. So as a clue, that was heavily amplified. Okay, most of you have voted. So we've got a very slight bias towards the brown long-eared, which is indeed correct, hence the amplified clue, because you probably really wouldn't hear it that clearly, but hopefully you're able to hear at least some of the ticks that make up the BLE call. I think that's one of the hardest there is. Okay, so we'll now play the third call. play that one again because it was quite short, if I can. Okay. Okay, so I'll put the poll up for that one. Okay, most of you have voted, so I'll end the poll there. So most of you have voted for the common pipistrelle, some barbastelle, some enthusiast pipistrelle. So it looks like most of you have picked up on the wet slap type sounds of the pipistrelles. That one's really hard. It's actually an enthusiast pipistrelle, but probably one of the only ways that you could tell that is if you knew that the peak frequency was around about 40 and a bit lower than that of the common pipistrelle. So number 4. Okay, so you can hear lots of feeding buzzers in there. I'll launch the poll. Okay, most of you have voted, so I'll leave it there. So most of you voted common pipistrelle, but tailing behind was the barbastelle. It was in fact the barbastelle. So again, quite hard. I find that one of the hardest to differentiate, but it was quite irregular, and that was probably your clue there, and less wet sounding, if you can grasp that wet slap that the pipistrelles have. Okay, so we'll move on to the last call. Okay, so I'll launch that last poll now for the final back call. Okay, so most of you have voted now for that remaining one, which is of course the one that was left, the common pipistrelle. So hopefully you could really hear the wet slaps in that one. I particularly like that specific call because that really got a lot of food. You can hear so many raspberry type feeding buzzes. Okay, so hopefully that was really interesting for you. And like I said, I'd really encourage you if you can to get hold of a bat detector. Even if you can't, if you can download that free app, go onto the Bat Conservation Trust website or the Warwickshire Bat Group website where they've got different calls for you to listen to. Just have a play about and have a go at seeing hearing if you can differentiate between the different bats. And right about now, you can also go out just before they're going into hibernation and see if you can see any bats like Faye mentioned in the video and differentiate them from the flights. Okay. There's also a bit of a quiz that was on the bottom there that I can send you the link to as well for those of you that signed up for the project. But you've probably been quizzed enough with bat calls now. One of the final things that you can do when surveying bats is to track them. So This can be done in a variety of different ways with different methods, but you should really only be looking at this, well, firstly, if you're highly licensed, but also if you want to and need to know specific information. So you might need to know for certain projects or developments, you might need to know the gender of the bats, the breeding status, where the roosts are located, their home ranges, how far they're travelling, where they're commuting to. It can also be useful to distinguish between different species of bats. There's a group of bats that are called Myotis species, and it can be quite hard to tell the difference between their different calls, so it can help with that as well. Different methods, for instance, mist netting and harp trapping. You can see a harp trap on the top right here. Bats sort of get caught in the net, as it were, and then you can pick them up. They don't come to any harm. You can lure them into these traps using acoustic lures, so bat sounds to attract them. You can also net them with a hand net if you need to, sometimes done in buildings. And of course, if you have trapped them, you can attach a radio tracker very carefully, again under license, and then you can track the bats to find out where they're travelling, which can be quite useful. So as well as surveying for bats, you can monitor them. So a lot of bat groups have bat monitoring programs using bat boxes. So Warwickshire Bat Group does monitor some bat boxes within Warwickshire. And I went out with Trisha Scott from Warwickshire Bat Group to have a look at some of the bat boxes that are present in Snitterfield Bushes, a Warwickshire Wildlife Trust Reserve. So I'll see if this will play, otherwise I'll open it up and share it differently. I took a video when I went out with her last month.
So today we are here at Snitterfield Bushes, which is a Warwickshire Wildlife Trust Reserve, and it's actually a designated SSSI because of the wide variety of flora and fauna that we have here in the woodland. So for instance, we get over 250 species of plants. You see some pretty cool orchids, for example, some early purple orchids. We also get some really good fungi here. So late summer and autumn is a really good time to come. You might see things like puffballs, for instance. And we get an array of mammals using the woodland, amongst other things. So we've got foxes and badgers, but we also have fallow deer and roe deer.
We've been joined by Trisha Scott, Chair of Warwickshire Bat Group, to see if any bats are currently roosting in bat boxes up on trees within the woodland. Checks usually take place in April or May and August or September, before the young are born and after they are flying independently. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, usual checks are not taking place. Today, we are looking at different bat box types within the woodland. We're looking inside some boxes from a distance with torches. And with extra health and safety precautions in place, under licence, Trisha checks some inside with an endoscope, a flexible camera. These Finnemore bat boxes were put up in 2018. Unlike bird boxes, there is an entrance plate at the bottom for bats to land and climb up on. There are divider baffles inside to stop light getting in and make it nice and snug. The thermal camera does not reveal any bats inside. There are several pipistrelle bats inside. As it is mating season, it is likely to be a male with females. Males find a suitable roost and call for females to join them. Fewer pipistrelles tend to be found in these other box types because they are too wide for the bats to feel snug and retain warmth. This Kent box has a resident. Larger liseless bats have been found in this part of the wood before, but not today. Boxes are useful in this wood because a lot of the trees are young, having been cut down in the war. Parts of the wood were used to store bombs, with overgrown bays still visible. Today it is managed for conservation. Dead wood is stacked upright to slow decay. Dead hedges are made from branches to prevent deer browsing, which can be seen in the distance. Sections are coppiced, with trees cut low to rejuvenate the woodland, and other sections are scalloped and cleared to allow sunlight to penetrate for butterflies. A reserve like this is a great place for bats, because there is plenty of undergrowth and plants of different heights and densities,
which means there are lots of insects. All of our UK bats are strictly insectivorous. Tricia has volunteered here for 20 years. Warwickshire Bat Group welcomes new members who can sign up to talks and get involved in surveying at box checks. With thanks to the National Lottery Heritage Fund who provided the funding for us to be able to do this great conservation work. This is part of the Wilder Future for Warwickshire project. #WilderFuture, #WilderWarwickshire.
So you can see what we got up to last month, which was obviously very different because of COVID. What would usually happen on bat box checks is that you would check the bat box, so you go up on a ladder and you would have a little peek inside to see if there are any bats in it. Then you would, if there were any bats, you would close it and bring it down the ladder. And then you would carefully open it up and take individual bats in the hand with gloves, of course. And you would have a look to see their general health, how their wings are. You'd assess their age. This can sometimes be done not only by size, but also looking to see if some of the bones in the hand have fused at the joints. You would also check to see the breeding status. Obviously, whether it's male or female, that would be dependent. You would measure the forearm of the bat, which is usually taken, and potentially you might ring the bat. So a little ring is placed on the top of one of the wings with a number on, and this allows monitoring to take place over time. Again, you need to be licensed to do all of this kind of thing, but it allows the bats to be monitored over time and can provide some really valuable data. So unfortunately, bats are threatened in the UK as elsewhere really. Elsewhere they face different threats. For instance, they might be persecuted because of damage that they're seen to do. This is quite common in fruit bats elsewhere in the world, or they might be eaten as bushmeat, for instance. Over here, some of the more common threats that they face are simply from buildings. So if they're demolished, there might be direct mortalities and they might be disturbed. Loss of habitat from building, for instance, but also in the more rural landscape from the removal of hedgerows. Also, bats are susceptible to poisoning potentially from pesticides, but really more it's the fact that the prey that they feed on is reduced, and this is also the case with changes in farmland management, which just reduces flying insects. Roads can of course cause direct mortality from bats colliding with traffic, but also fragments the landscape. So generally bats tend to avoid roads if they can, so they won't reach the other side. This can interfere with their foraging and commuting routes and ability to access other roosts. Things like cat attacks are quite common in gardens, and chemical treatments in houses can have an impact. For instance, if timber has been treated in attics. Also, roofing membranes can be a problem in terms of some of the newer ones tend to be breathable roofing membranes, as an example of the picture on the right here, and bats can actually get really entangled in those. So that can be a problem too. Bats can receive kind of direct impact trauma from wind turbines, and also it can change their behaviour. So they might avoid them, and therefore they might change their foraging and commuting routes. And this can be a particular problem for migrating bat species and for offshore wind farms. Also, lighting is often a problem for bats. So bats are nocturnal. They are designed to come out at night where there are fewer predators. Some bat species can be attracted to lights, for instance lampposts, because they attract insects, so they fly under them to get the insects. But this actually leaves themselves open to predation in this open area. Most or other bat species that we have are negatively impacted by the lighting in the sense that they will avoid bright lighting. So again, this can cause all kinds of behavioural impacts and change the way they forage. Climate change is potentially impactful. So we know from those of you that attended the hedgehog webinar a few days ago that for any hibernating species this might be an issue. Bats hibernate to conserve energy in the winter when there isn't much food around. If we've got fluctuating temperatures in the winter and they keep waking up but there's not that much food around, they will eventually lose a lot of energy, and this could be quite detrimental. On the other hand, if things remain warm, then they may have a longer breeding season and ability to find food before they need to hibernate. So in terms of managing habitat for bats and things that we can do, particularly to help them with these threats, again, I'll break it down into things that we can do to help with foraging habitat, commuting habitat, and also roosting habitat. So in terms of foraging, you need to think what is going to encourage insects. So you can plant all kinds of different flowering plants, ideally ones that will flower and come into different seasons at different times, so that you've got an all-round different biodiversity that will attract different insects. Particularly of use are night-scented flowers and flowering plants, and pale ones, because these attract nighttime insects, which of course bats will eat. You can plant flower-rich meadows and areas of scrub and some trees in barren open areas, which again will increase the feeding opportunities for the bats. Leaving some lawn to grow long, even in your own garden or small patch, can be really useful, because it means that it encourages different invertebrate larvae as well, which will some of them will fly. Freshwater sources are really important. So I mentioned before that bats do drink, and also they're a great source of insects for bats. So encouraging those and vegetation around those is really important, and they can provide linear features as well. You can enhance vertical surfaces with things like living walls or climbers and creepers if you're less adventurous. Green roofs as well are really useful, and what we call swales, so areas to help us drain water in urban areas, which provide stepping stones and also corridors and feeding lines for them to forage along. Retaining wood is really useful in woodlands, but also in your own garden. You can make log piles, for instance, or you can even get an insect hedgehog hotel. You can even get an insect hotel, which will encourage invertebrates too. You can ideally retain native trees or plant native trees, particularly in urban areas where there aren't trees, because these will encourage more diverse insects than non-native trees. Veteran trees are really important, so we've looked at a few of the tree features earlier on in the talk, but wherever possible they should be maintained and retained, and connected as well, so you can connect them with other trees and with hedgerows. Woodlands should undergo management, so on rotation areas can be coppiced and thinned. So I mentioned that they can be cut right down the trees so that they can encourage regrowth. And basically this will mean that you get an undergrowth of herbal plants and a layer at the bottom of the woodland of plants that are good for insects, rather than it all being old trees that shade out the undergrowth completely and stop it from growing. There's a great guide for managing woodland for bats by the Forestry Commission. The link is down there. So in terms of commuting habitat, if you know that there are commuting routes for bats, ideally you should try and preserve those routes. So these tend to be along linear features, so they might be tree lines, waterways that are lined with vegetation, parks, garlands, woodland edges, and of course hedgerows. If you can help it, it would be good to not have gaps, or to gap up the ones that do have gaps, because bats don't like to cross them like with roads. Ideally, if you've got hedges, which are fantastic, you know I love a hedge, then you'll want these to be nice and tall and bushy and wide, with some base vegetation at the sides as well. And if you can, have some standard trees in there as well, mixed in with the lower hedge and shrubbier species. If in urban areas, trees along streets are really useful, as are waterways, like even canals and things, if they're lined with vegetation particularly. It's better to have them unlit, because we know that bats like to prefer to avoid lit areas, but this can conflict obviously with pedestrian safety concerns. In terms of roosting, you want to keep those veteran trees that we mentioned before, but also you need to provide a buffer around those trees. So you don't just want to go and cut and coppice right up until those trees, which will become isolated and not great patches for bats. So you want to have a buffer zone around those, which is not managed in that way. You also want to try and retain and keep and create small woodland patches wherever possible. Generally, bats like to roost within 440 metres of some sort of woodland, even if it's a tiny patch. So these are really beneficial. New buildings, wherever possible, should have provisions for roosting bats. So integrated bat boxes, like you can see on the right here from this infographic from the Bat Conservation Trust, are great if they're installed in houses, but you can also install bat boxes that we saw in the videos previously. And bat boxes can be great, but you do need to think about where you position them. So ideally, they should be above the ground, several metres. For buildings, under the eaves is quite a good place. And they should be in sunny but sheltered areas, so usually south facing in Britain. And they should be somewhere logical where bats are likely to find and use them. So in or around foraging areas is ideal. You can also construct hibernacular. So this is a bit hit and miss. We haven't really perfected this yet. Sometimes a lot have been created and they haven't been used. So there's a lot to learn here. But ideally, you want those hibernacular to be cool and humid. Even something like a dry stone wall can provide a hibernaculum for a bat. So lots to learn there. Final thing when thinking about habitat is connectivity. So we've got loads of great stepping stones. So gardens can be fantastic. You've got little parks, even balconies. If you've got a balcony, if you put some pot plants on there, that can be a little stepping stone for bats too. And of course, green roofs. However, these do need to be connected wherever possible. If you've got really big fragmentation features, so something like motorways or railways, you can try and use underpasses and green bridges. So these come under a lot of fire, and there's been a lot of bad press about how much they've cost. We are still learning, particularly in Britain, we're lagging behind. But we do know that they're more likely to be used if they're combined with vegetation. So if it's an underpass, if you've got vegetation going up into the edge of the entrance, and green bridges, if you can make it linear vegetation all the way across the bridge, they're more likely to be used. And this, of course, will minimise collisions as well with the traffic. Also, if you can try and minimise the lighting on these features, that is better, and they're more likely to be used. In general, in terms of lighting, if we can only light areas that really need to be lit to the extent that they need to be lit, that's better. And we need to try and minimise spill. So there are all kinds of lighting designs now. Some of them, if you can imagine, sort of a lamp post with a cone on, so it stops light from overspilling too far, can be really useful. And there's lots of designs on those, particularly for new developments now. You can find out loads more information on these kind of habitat management things. Again, at the Bat Conservation Trust website, they've got a special leaflet for this. In terms of the work we do at Warwickshire Wildlife Trust for bats, we generally manage the habitat for bats. So we don't generally do many surveys. We work with Warwickshire Bat Group for this, but we do manage habitat in a sympathetic way wherever possible. So the main project that's really helping bats at the moment is the Dunsmore Living Landscape project. If anyone knows about this, it does have its own website. So a lot of the work that's being done there is to restore and maintain and create hedgerow connectivity, which we know is really important for bats. The map here shows the location of the different woods within the project area, so you can see it is quite wooded for Warwickshire at least. Also managing those woodlands appropriately. So we've talked about thinning and coppicing, and also we manage the ride. So we try and open up the paths a bit more to get sunlight and to attract that undergrowth, to attract more insects. Also, there's a lot of pond restoration going on, and we know that water sources, of course, are important to bats too. So just to finish off today's talk, before, if people want to, they can stay for questions. So I thought I'd bring this all together to look at ways that we can research bats and help bats. So I actually did my master's dissertation on bats, so I looked at natural roosts within fine-mere wood, which is a wood that's a really nice wood, semi-natural ancient woodland in the Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire area. And it forms a complex of woodlands that you can see on the map here, and it used to be the old Hunting Burnwood Forest complex. So hopefully you can see different features on the habitat on the map. So there is a river running to the southwest. There are also various lakes and water bodies. It's surrounded by arable and pastoral farmlands with lots of interconnecting hedgerows. And there is a freight railway line running to the southwest as well, running diagonally there. The wood itself is mostly made up of oak and ash, but there is a maple, hawthorn and hazel understory. And it's particularly interesting to do a project on because it's been monitored for such a long time. So they put bat boxes up and have been monitoring those since 2003, and they've actually been ringing bats since 2006. Interestingly, it's great for bats. You get about 9 species that have been recorded there so far. In particular, Bechstein's bats are there, which are quite rare woodland specialists that like to forage in the woodland itself. And there's actually a genetically bottlenecked population there, which is quite vulnerable at the moment. Unfortunately for this woodland, essentially where this freight line is going to be HS2. So my project was particularly important in providing data to have a look at the bats that were in Fine Wood in relation to this. So I actually took loads of details of different roosts that have been found there already. So because lots of research has been done there, they have already done radio tracking to locate bats to natural roosts in the woodland. So these were already some of which were known. And they've also done dusk and dawn emergence surveys for some of these roosts. So I chose 10 of these roosts across the woodlands with different characteristics, and I looked at all of their characteristics. So I measured, for instance, the space inside, the shape inside, the entrance, how big it was. I measured how many trees were in the vicinity, what species, how close, how shaded it was, the aspect, all of the different features that you could think of. And I also had a look at the temperature both within the roost. So you can see there's a sensor that's wrapped in some foam here to stop it getting excreted on at the top of the bat roost here. And there is a matching ambient sensor just to the outside of the roost here. And I had a look at whether those roosts were being occupied that particular summer. So I could tell this by having a look each month to see if bats were actually inside. So I had a look with an endoscope, and I radio tracked to see if bats were going there, along with a team of many other volunteers, and also had a look for bat droppings to see if there's evidence of bats visiting in between those visits that I made. And also I was able to tell if groups of bats had roosted by the internal temperature sensors. So this is an example of a graph of one that had seen some bats inside. So don't worry too much, but you've got the temperature on the axis on the left here, and then you've got the dates and times over here. So the ambient temperature is the orange line that fluctuates up and down. So it decreases in temperature in the night when it gets colder, and it increases in the day. Now the blue line is the roost temperature, the internal temperature of the roost. So you can see this is fairly stable, and then it starts to fluctuate and is considerably higher in the middle section here. And this is because we've got bats roosting. So in the day it significantly warms up, and then it lowers again at night when the bats go out to forage. Now what I found across the 10 different natural roosts that I studied was that some roosts seem to be more popular than others. And the most popular roost was a woodpecker hole in an old oak tree near the woodland edge. But I found that it was really stable in temperature. So you can see the ambient temperature fluctuating in terms of time of day here, the orange line. But this blue line is inside the roost. So you can see it's really stable in temperature. And this was in comparison to the least occupied roost, the one that was least used by the bats that summer. And as you can tell, the temperature inside the roost is very similar to the ambient temperature outside. So I found that bats generally selected natural roosts that were warm, and they like to use the ones that were warm and more stable in temperature. And a previous study had looked at bat boxes in terms of temperature inside the woodland, and had found that, and I found that actually these natural roosts were even more stable in temperature than some of those bat boxes. I also found that bats were quite loyal to some of these roosts, so particularly the popular ones. So I had data to show the radio tracking of where bats have been found in the different species for previous years. And I found when I compared it with the data that I'd got for that year, that certain bat species tended to use certain roosts at certain times of year every year. So for instance, that best roost that I showed you that was most used on the graph before was always used as a pre-maternity roost in May by Bechstein's bats. So they obviously had features at that time of year that those bats really liked. There was also some interesting interactions with birds. Sometimes birds will bully bats out of roosts, but they basically just take up roosts that bats could be using. So they form competition really. But sometimes it can be beneficial. So in this roost that you can see here, with lots of staining around this outside of where bats were coming in and out, the nuthatches actually earlier in the year would plaster mud around the entrance hole to make it smaller and less liable to predation. And the bats really liked that. So when the nuthatches had left, the bats would then come in and use that as a post-maternity roost with the mud on the outside. So just to finish up, results like these can actually inform future management. So we know from studies like that and the ones that I've done on all the data that the North Bucks Bat Group have collated over the years, that certain trees are really important for that wood, and we need to maintain them and maintain the buffer around them. We also need to preserve some of the water bodies that were found to be important too. But also these kinds of studies can inform developments like HS2. So we might want to try and mimic some of the features with tree surgery that we've found to be important. We need to think about how bats are travelling across and commuting across to these other woodlands over here, and perhaps think about green bridges, underpasses, those kind of things, and the lightings that's going to be put there. Okay, so thanks very much. That's the end of the talk now. The main resources that I can recommend really that I've referred to throughout this talk are from the Bat Conservation Trust and also Warwickshire Bat Group. I would recommend certain books as well. So if you're really into your bats, you can check out John Altringham's book, this one here. Also, the Natural History Museum has got a really nice bats book here. And I can send out all these resources to those of you signed up as volunteers, along with the slides, etc. At a later date. So don't worry about noting it all down. If you do want to sign up to the project, please do check out the website and make an inquiry. It's just at the bottom here. Other than that, thank you very much for listening, and I'll now open it up to questions. So if you can all unmute yourselves, and those of you that are okay to do so, turn your videos on, and then if you can either physically raise your hand so that I can see you on the video, or if you can digitally raise your hand on Zoom, then please do so. I'll stop sharing the presentation now. Okay, so I hope I didn't bore you too much. There's quite a lot of information to take in. Does anyone have any questions? Becca, okay, sure, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hiya.
Hi.
Very much. That was really interesting. Really interesting. I was just wondering, are there any species of bat that have gone extinct in England? Are we aware?
It's a good question. So we've got the greater mouse-eared bat, known as a sort of vagrant species that occasionally turns up. Okay, yeah, so there's some pictures on the Bat Conservation Trust site I will try and share with you now. So hopefully you can all see those. So yeah, it's one of our sort of vagrant species that sometimes we see, but we'd like to encourage to stay. So there's that one. There's also the grey long-eared bat that's not very common as well. Okay. So I'll stop sharing that one now. Hopefully you can see some of those hastily drawn up pictures. Any other questions? Sally, if you want to unmute yourself.
What time of year is it best to do like surveys and stuff? Is it like springtime when they're coming out of hibernation?
Yeah. So good question. So it depends on the survey that you want to do. So if you're doing a hibernation survey, for instance, then you'll need to do that in the winter. Most surveys are done in the springtime, summertime. So if you're doing something that's quite invasive, like bat box checks, for instance, then you would try to avoid the peak breeding season, so you don't disturb the mums and the babies. So you do that like before, so sort of June-ish time, and then after kind of autumn time. But other surveys you want to be doing in the summer, particularly if you want to pick up maternity roosts. There are all sorts of guidelines on bat surveys, how many surveys you need to do and exactly how far apart those need to be and what weather conditions need to be present in order for those to be acceptable for ecological survey results. But yeah, largely you're looking in the summer season. That's when you'll see some very tired bat ecologists who are working, doing lots of dusk and dawn surveys, accruing lots of toil for them to take off later in the year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Emma, if you want to unmute yourself.
I think you mentioned maybe with respect to wind turbines that some bats migrate. Do any of the UK species do that, or is it bats sort of travelling from elsewhere?
Yeah, it's mostly ones that are abroad, basically. We don't really have that many migrating species over here. I've mentioned some vagrant species that sometimes come over, but really we're talking more foreign bats. But you know, even if you're looking in places like little offshore islands, if you've got wind farms, you know, that can impact bats. And of course, just generally on normal land, doesn't have to be offshore wind farms. If they're like in commuting or flight paths for bats, then that's potentially a problem. Mainly more in places like Scotland and places like that have the offshore places.
Thank you.
No worries. Anyone else? Oh, Becca again, if you want to unmute yourself. Oh, I still
Sorry. I was just wondering, so when they do build wind turbine farms, then do they have to do a lot of ecological surveys working out the flight paths of bats then in the local area to be able to do them then?
Yes, so it's something that's still evolving. There are some quite big guidelines that came out fairly recently now about bats and wind turbines. It sort of started off with very little known about it. But yeah, essentially they've got to do all kinds of surveys usually. A lot of those will involve the static bat detectors that I talked about and having them positioned for weeks to have a look at where the bats are flying. And also they are usually monitored once the bats are once the wind turbines are present and the bats are there. So actually there's some really interesting research that goes on with dogs. So sniffer dogs are now employed at several wind farms to sniff out to see if there are dead bats as part of the monitoring programme, because it's quite hard to see a dead bat, but dogs are very good at picking them up, so they're good at monitoring to see if changes need to be made. There's all sorts of things that you can do. So you can turn wind turbines off at certain periods. If you know that the bats are all flying around there at dusk, then you can turn the wind turbines off for a couple of hours to limit that. And you can turn it back on in the day when they're all safely away roosting, for instance. There's also a lot of modelling work to be done. So for those of you keen beans on QGIS, for instance, mapping software online, you can model the impacts of the noise and the flight lines and things like that before you actually put up the wind turbines. But there are all sorts of rules for surveying before and also monitoring the progress of those wind turbines.
Thank you.
All right. Eleanor, if you want to unmute yourself.
I think you mentioned earlier about, say, like if a building had to be demolished and there was like a roost inside, how would they go about moving like all of the individuals? Would they have to catch them or?
Yeah, I mean, this is you have to be quite licensed to be involved in these kind of things. Sometimes, well, usually what is suggested is that the work is done when there are no bats present. So we know that bats like to move, so you know, they like to move around in their roosts. So what you would do is try and find out when they're there and when they're not there. So you would try and do it at a time of year that isn't going to affect them. Not good in COVID times. Also, you would need to provide some kind of mitigation, some kind of alternative roost for them to use nearby, which are sometimes successful and sometimes aren't. If you really had to do it at that time, if you really had to demolish that building and there were bats in there, you would need someone licensed to come and net them and remove them. But it would be unlikely usually for that to happen, for it to have gotten to that stage. Any other questions? Well, I can't see any, but as always, if you do have any, please do feel free to email me at any time and I'll try and help you out. I don't know everything about bats. I can't claim to be a bat ecologist, which takes many, many years of training, but I've done my fair share of looking at bats and I can signpost you, hopefully, if I don't know the answer. I would really check out those resources at the Bat Conservation Trust in particular. They're so useful, and you can think about joining as well. I think it's something like £30 a year. If you're really into your bats, you get loads of resources and things like that. But other than that, try and get out and about in the next week or so before bats are hibernating. See if you can see any or pick up any signs, or also, you know, maybe add a heterodyne detector to your Christmas list if you really want one. They range between about £50 and £70, I think, for the usual ones. We'll see if you can borrow them. Or alternatively, we have bat detectors at Warwickshire Wildlife Trust that we use on our bat walks, which are usually running in non-COVID times. So you can check those out next season when we do our bat walks. We also do cruises usually along Stratford, if you want to join those, where you can see bats along the river. As we know, waterways are good places for bats. So other than that, I think you're all, from what I can see now, the people that are left are all young adult ambassadors. Woo, good on you for signing up. So I will send you over a whole bunch of resources, feedback forms, etc. This week. And if you would like, please do sign up to the Slugs webinar. I know it doesn't sound adventurous, but honestly, I've been on a slug course myself and it's actually really fascinating. And the lady who's doing it is really entertaining, so she'll show you some cool videos. So please do attend that if you can. But thanks very much. Sorry about that, we'll play it this way.